Politics had gotten to the point of erasing the poor, at least as an act of language. It wasn't that there weren't some policies, mostly Democratic of course, aimed at helping the poor, but the conversation had a say their names problem. Everyone wanted to talk explicitly about the middle class, but only in euphemism about the poor. In 2011, President Obama became only the second Democratic president since Harry Truman in 1948, whose State of the Union did not include a single explicit mention of the poor or poverty. Instead, he leaned on terms like the mostly vulnerable. Now, I will admit that is prettier and that is more poetic, but when you are poor, you don't need a 50-cent word to solve your penny problems. And this is unfortunate because President Obama absolutely did things to help the poor. Obamacare is a giant advance for the poor. But when you are struggling with poverty, as my family has, you need people to see you and to say your name so that they are forced to reckon with you. You can't solve this problem sideways. Instead, politicians talk so much about the middle class that people think that they're part of the middle class even when they're not part of the middle class. A 2015 Pew Research Center survey found that a third of families with an income between $30,000 and $50,000 considered themselves to be middle class. Even more striking, though, was that a third of those making $30,000 or less also thought of themselves as middle class. But the Biden administration is providing a welcome change to this narrative, not only consistently talking to and about the poor in explicit language, but also engaging in one of the most aggressive anti-poverty pushes in generations. Today, Biden is in Louisiana, one of the poorest states in America, to push his American Families Plan, which would actually relieve some of that poverty. To discuss this is the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, Bishop William Barber. Bishop Barber, I am so excited to have you on the program. This is right up your alley. When we were talking about this story, you were the only person that I wanted to talk about poverty in America with. I am so happy you're here. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Charles, and I'm so glad to know that you're doing this now. We really need your voice, your insight, and that's not just I'm saying something. I'm very serious about that.
So just tell us, how you see the state of poverty in America and whether or not the structures, I'm not now talking specifically about DC, is doing enough to both mention, discuss openly that there are poor people in this country, openly discuss policies directly aimed at those poor people. What are your opinions about where we are right now in poverty?
Well, I'm certainly glad to see President Biden listening to us. We've met with him before he was running. In fact, we were the first group to have all 10 of the future presidential candidates in 2019, and we had them come before a poverty Congress. And in 2020, we had a gathering where 1.4 million people were gathering to do more, mobilize, organize, register, educate poor and low-wealth people. And Biden said then, he said that poverty would not just be an aspiration, but a theory of change. In June of last year, we had 2.4 million people join us for a mass Poor People's Assembly virtual march on Washington. We had planned to have it in face-to-face, but we couldn't because of COVID. What we're saying, Charles, is what you said. You can't deal with this sideways. There are 5 interlocking injustices: systemic racism in all of its forms, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism that all have impacted and have created a reality where prior to COVID, we had 140 million poor and low wealth people in this country. Prior to COVID, not one county in this country could you work a job $7.25 an hour and afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. Before COVID, 87 million people uninsured or underinsured. Before COVID, we had 250,000 people, 750 a day, dying from poverty, according to a study by Columbia. 62 million people making less than a living wage. And let me break it down for black folk. 60.9% of black folk live in poverty and low wealth. You said something that people say they're in the middle class, not really in the middle class, because 60.9% of people in poverty, 60.9% of black people live in poverty, that's 26 million people. 30% of white people live in poverty and low wealth. That's 66 million people. So we have a 40% higher, 30% higher rate percentage-wise, but there are 40 million more poor and low wealth white people. And it's not a matter of scarcity. We've got the money. It's not a matter of ideas. It's consciousness, it's power building, it's will, it's putting a face on poverty. So we built a campaign of 45 poor people campaigns in states from Alabama to Appalachia, from California to Carolina, from Massachusetts to Michigan. Poor and low wealth people, religious leaders and advocates coming together around an agenda. We actually put an agenda before the president's policy team called 14 points for the healing of the nation. And one of them is we first have to talk about poverty right and measure it right. We have to have living wages. We have to have guaranteed income. We have to have infrastructure that focuses on poor and low wealth community. We must deal with systemic racism, especially voter suppression and those things that hurt not only black people and brown people, but poor white people. And if we're serious about moving forward, we need a comprehensive view and a comprehensive approach, not just one or two little policies here and then we run away from it.
See, one of the things that's so interesting about your movement, you focus so much on these fusion coalitions, which I guess is what Dr. King was focused on at the end of his life, which was getting poor people to recognize that across all other differences, including race, they have a common agenda. And if they would act, as one or in one direction, that they would actually be able to have more solutions to their problems. But that's not how it works, right? So Du Bois pointed this out beautifully in his writing, that many of the overseers of the enslaved people were poor white people because they were aspirational in their whiteness, right? They assumed that being an overseer or being a slave catcher connected them more with the planter class than with being poor. And that tension has pulled people apart for decades, a century or more. How are you doing this work where you focus so much on bringing all these poor people together across their differences?
Yeah. Well, Charles, part of that history that you said is exactly right. But we also remember Dr. King said in the end of 1965, the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, he said every time the white and poor masses of the South decide that they're in the same boat and determined to unite together, that Southern aristocracy, the ruling class, intentionally sows division because of their fear that if that ever happens, it'll change the economic architecture of the country. So let's also say this was intentional. It's always intentional. In the last election, however, people need to know 55% of poor and low wealth people voted for Biden-Harris. There's poor and low wealth people now represent 30% of the electorate, 65 million people. We did a study with Columbia University, and it said in 15 states, Michigan, North Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Georgia, and several others, in 15 states, if you could get just 1 to 22% of poor and low wealth, black, brown, Asian, indigenous people to vote together around an agenda, they could determine who sits in the Senate, the White House, and state house. Now think about that, not 30%, not 40%. In Michigan, it's only 1%. In North Carolina, it's 19%. In Florida, it's 4%. So we actually have more power available than we have organized. And we have to recognize that this was intentional. I think it was Kevin Phillips, who worked for Richard Nixon, who said back in the 60s, we have to engage in something called positive division. He said positive division, intentionally dividing black and white people in the South and make the Republican Party the party of white people. And that was heavily funded. I mean, heavily funded by the ruling class. So what we do is we go into these communities like Appalachia and the Delta, and we don't back up from the issue of race. In fact, Charles, you might want to know that when I go to Harlan County, Kentucky, or any of those, the first issue we deal with is race. Now, the way we do it is we do it through the penetration point of racist voter suppression. So we put a big thing on the wall and we show everybody in that state that has benefited from racial voter suppression. Then we show all the policies that they have voted on. I was in a session one time and the white guy stood up and said, well, damn, Reverend, it looks like they're playing us against each other. I said, that's right. What are we going to do about it? Now, in 2018, we organized in 5 counties in rural eastern North Carolina. 3 of them flipped from Trump counties to blue counties, and the governor of that state, the candidate unseated a sitting governor using our methodology. This can, in fact, work. In fact, every time in history, whether it was a Reconstruction or even the Civil Rights Movement, there always had to be some fusion. But here's the place where people make a mistake, Charles. They often make the mistake of trying to have fusion and bypass race. What we say is race must be front. Race, poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism must be understood and grappled with as a whole. And we find that when you do that, it's more people out here ready to organize around that kind of fusion movement than we think.
What do you say to people who try to have a kind of competition, an Olympics of oppressions, and say, well, isn't class the bigger issue than race, or isn't race the bigger issue than class? Isn't part of your message that they're inextricably linked?
When somebody say, is it race or class, I say it is. It is. It's race and class. I mean, why fool around with that? Listen, this pandemic exposed the fissures of racism and poverty. Look at what happened. We have a pandemic. We already were at 43% of the nation living in poverty and low wealth before the pandemic. We go into the pandemic, 8 million more Americans go into poverty, but billionaires make $1.5 trillion. The first COVID bill, 84% of the money went to banks and corporations. In the midst of a pandemic, we have not provided universal health care. We call people essential workers, but we didn't give them essential wages. The very people that saved us during this pandemic were the poorest that had to go to work, they got infected, got sick, went to the hospital and died. You know, they're not even really measuring how this pandemic killed poor and low wealth people. And so what we say to folk is there comes a point that you have to say, listen, if I'm black or if I'm white and I can't pay my light bill, we're all black in the dark. If I'm sick with cancer and I don't have health care, whether I'm black or white or brown, the cancer does not care. You don't have the treatment you need. If a child is groaning, that child doesn't groan black or white or brown, he groans hunger and pain. We're losing $1 trillion a year from child poverty just alone. There are 62 million people in this country who make less than $17 an hour. If we raise the minimum wage to $15 right now, not only would it lift 40% of working class black people out of poverty, it would pump $330 billion into the economy. So we just had a study done by the Economic Policy Institute where they actually said a moral agenda that addresses these issues is also an economically sound agenda. And an agenda that doesn't address these issues is morally indefensible, constitutionally inconsistent, and economically insane.
Bishop Barber, never one to shy away from speaking truth to power on behalf of the poor, had this to say during his testimony to the House Budget Committee in 2019.
The growing gap between the rich and the poor in this country is a direct result of policy decisions, not the immorality and the lack of personal work of poor people. Policy decisions made here in Washington and in our state capitals, but those decisions have been supported by well-funded myths. Corporate interests have sent their representatives here to preach personal responsibility and the danger of government intervention. But the truth is we must take a collective responsibility for the inequality, the unjust laws and systems created. God did not make us poor. Greed and abuse and power make us poor.
Back with Bishop Barber. Bishop Barber, please talk to us about this myth of personal responsibility as it relates to poverty.
Yeah, it's a great myth. It's immoral. It's often pushed by so-called religious nationalists, just like they push this scripture about the poor will be with you always, which is a text, but they misinterpret it. The actual text is the poor will be with you always because you cheat them. That's what the scripture actually says. But this business that people aren't working hard enough. Listen, you can work 40 hours a week at $7.25 an hour, not even be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment in any county in this country. We've got people working for $2.13 an hour in the restaurant industry. The issue is not that people are lazy. The issue is that they're not being provided the kind of wages they need to live. The infrastructure in poor communities it's not bad because folk are lazy, it's because we haven't made the investment. We haven't made the investment. The reason we don't have health care, we're the only country of the 25 wealthiest countries that connects health care to your job and not to your body. And most people don't know if one military contract from Boeing for 1 year could pay for all of the states that refuse to expand Medicaid. So what we have is a lack of consciousness and a commitment to policy. As I said, early on, we waste cost us about $2.6 trillion just because of the gap in income based on gender. Right now in this country, if we took 350, I'm not saying we do that, but just think for a minute. We spend $750 billion on military, war economy. If we cut that in half, we would still spend more than China, Russia, Iraq, Iran, and North Korea combined. If we took $750 million over 5 years, we could implement, for instance, automatic voter registration, make our democracies more secure, give poor people more opportunity to vote. That's only 1/1000th of what we put in the Pentagon. So the problem is not the immorality of people, it's the immorality of a society. And I'm going to tell you, one of the most racist and class-based things I've seen recently was when on the Friday before Bloody Sunday, 49 Republicans and then those 8 Democrats joined together to block living wages in a COVID relief bill. And the 8 Democrats particularly bothered me because they know better, and Manchin should be ashamed because there are hundreds of thousands of poor and low-wealth people and working poor people in the state of West Virginia. I was up there, Charles, in the mountains with white women who on Monday have Taco Mondays so they can make money to help buy other women's menstrual supplies. Now that's ugly to say, but people need to hear that's what people are doing, and these are working folk. The bottom line is, when they did that, why did I call it racist? Because they said to 40% of black folk, you need to stay in poverty. Why do I call it elitist and class-based? Because we constantly give tax cuts to the wealthy. We constantly raise the salary for our politicians, but we refuse to give people a living wage. The immorality is the immorality of the system. And since I'm a preacher, I know a lot of people may not, but I have to say this. There's a scripture in the Bible, Isaiah chapter 10, verse 1, that says, woe unto you who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. If we're going to have a conversation about death like police killings, which we should, but we also got to talk about policy death. People die from the lack of health care, the lack of income. They die. And we need to put a face on the death that's being caused because of the dearth of public policy that addresses what 43% of this nation is facing.
For our last question here, I want to shift gears just a little bit. You spoke at Andrew Brown's funeral, and you seem to be putting religion as a central element of our activism. Do you see that religion plays enough of a role, or what role does religion play in modern activism, in Black Lives Matter and other groups, movements about Black lives?
Well, I have a lot of engagement with brothers and sisters in Black Lives Matter, and a lot of them that don't have any problem with a religious perspective that presents justice. They have a problem with a religious perspective that just sits inside a sanctuary, or like white evangelicalism tends to try to consecrate injustice and prejudice and greed. The truth of the matter is there has never been any major movement in this country that has had fundamental change that didn't have a moral element in it somewhere, that didn't lean into the deepest moral recesses of our religious traditions and our constitutional traditions. So one of the things we tried to do in Andrew Brown's death, this is a 42-year-old man with 7 children, a father, a nephew, a grandson, a son, shot 4 times in the arm and in the back. He was killed. They said they were delivering a warrant. They found no drugs, no gun. He was shot in the back. And anyway, a warrant is not a license to kill. We know of cases, I was reading a story the other day of 8 situations where white men who actually mass murdered people, some of them, were arrested and not killed. Some of them given lunch once they were arrested. So when officers of the law act with a kind of impunity that they have the right to execute on the spot, that is theological. Because you're acting as though you're not just judge and jury, but God. And so what I'm trying to say is this is a moral crisis. A gun and a badge and the right to kill in the name of the people, is too much power for a racist, a bigot, or a trigger-happy cop. I don't care if you're black or white, because there's a black cop that shot Donovan Lynch in West Virginia, and they didn't even have their body cameras on. So for me, it doesn't matter. You cannot take life in your hands. Secondly, lastly, we have to have truth. And that's a deep moral truth and justice are critical. So to a moral perspective, so what does it look like in this issue of policing? Truth, accountability. When you find out that the police have murdered or executed someone, there must be arrest. There must be prosecution without impunity, federal if necessary. There must be prison. There must be payment, and all the payment can't come from insurance companies. These cops need to have to pay personally. These police departments need to have to pay. And then there needs to be top to bottom practice and a review of their practices in these police departments. There has to be all of that and not some of it. But ultimately, Charles, when you get to the point that you think you have the right to take my life just because you feel like it or just because you don't like black people, for me, that is a theological crisis. That's a moral crisis.
Bishop Barber, I just want to thank you for spending this time with us tonight. We are in awe of you. We are inspired by you. Keep doing what you're doing.